All right. So, again, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here this morning. My name's Adriana Spindle Jackson, and I supported the community engagement efforts on the Clean Air project. Today, we are going to be providing a project overview to give you an idea of who worked on the Clean Air project and what our goals were. The bulk of today's presentation will be about our long and short-term monitoring findings. And then we'll, like I said before, open it up for some question and answer to hear any thoughts or questions that come up for you during the presentations. We also have some resources for ways to further engage with the project, which we'll share at the end of the presentation. Next slide. So there are so many people and organizations that played a role in completing this project. It has been a truly interdisciplinary effort. We would not be able to name all of them. However, we wanted to highlight some that are on the slide right now. We've gotten a lot of support from these and other partners over the course of the last 3 years. And so just wanted to make sure that we highlighted all of the organizations that both our team members and partners have come from, which we would not have been able to complete this project without them. I will now hand it over to Greer, who will kick us off with a project overview.
Hi, everyone. My name is Greer Hamilton. I'm also one of the folks who helped to support the community engagement aspect of this project, which we'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute. But the Clean Air Project, which stands for the Community-Led Improvement of Air Quality in the Lower Mystic, was a 3-year funded project funded by the Environmental Protection Agency. And it was led by Mystic River Watershed Association. And the goal of our grant was focused on improving air quality in 4 watershed communities: Everett, Malden, and 2 which were in Boston, Charlestown, and East Boston. And our goals were to generate air quality knowledge via measurements, to help to deliver actionable data and findings that were both responsive to community express interests, and also to boost capacity for air quality related knowledge that communities could use in the future. Now, as I mentioned, community engagement was a large part of our project. So you'll hear a lot about the monitoring that was done over the 3 years, some of which, again, came or was informed by our community members in different ways. So one way that we did community engagement was forming a community advisory board. So each community had representation from 3 residents, one of those residents being a young person under 18, 2 being adults over 18. CAB members served with us over the 3 years and met quarterly with us to hear about what the project was working on and to inform us about different directions our monitoring work was going in. We also created and conducted a community survey to understand residents' perceptions of air quality in the 4 communities and collected over 400 surveys, again, over about a 2-year span, to help us understand what locations were of interest to people and what were other issues related to air quality that they were dealing with. And then also throughout the project, we've hosted various data sharing events. So early on in the project, we hosted what we called listening sessions. And these were ways for us to share preliminary data from the surveys with residents to understand if they hadn't taken a survey, what were other things that they were dealing with. It also was an opportunity for us to share information about how air quality impacts people's health, as well as to gather feedback about next steps of the project. We also met with municipal leaders at different stages of the project to share back what we were learning and also to also have their input help to guide decision making. And then we have been conducting what we've been calling report out sessions, which are closing events this year as we're wrapping up our project. And these have been ways for us to share, again, summaries of our survey data, but also summaries of the long and short-term monitoring, which you'll be hearing today. And I will be passing this over to John.
Hi, I'm John Durant. I'm from the monitoring part of the team. I'm going to talk to you about two things. I have 2 slides I'm going to talk about. The first one is talking about traffic-related air pollution, which is a big focus of our studies, simply because we're in communities that are heavily impacted by transportation sources. So TRAP stands for traffic-related air pollution, and it really derives from cars and buses and trucks and trains, planes, anything with a internal combustion engine, principally. And then tire and brake wear is also a big source of particles that get into the air. So you could think of trap as being a complex mixture of both particles and gases. The particles are I'll talk about those in another slide. But the gases are things like carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, NO2, nitrogen dioxide, NO, which is nitric oxide. You also get a lot of water vapor. You get hydrocarbons, unburned hydrocarbons, partially burned hydrocarbons coming out of engines. And you also get a lot of droplets and particles, including ultrafine particles, which are really, really small, can get deep into your lungs. These are particles that are less than 100 nanometers in diameter, so they're really, really small. And I'll show you a slide. Um, uh, yeah, fine. Let's go to the next slide. So on the left, you see a diagram of a human hair, and next to it is some beach sand. And what we're trying to do with this slide is show you the size range of particles. So the ones where I was talking about in the previous slide, ultrafine particles are really, really small. They're less than 100 nanometers, which is 1/25th of the diameter of that pink dot there. The really small particles can get down into your lungs and get into your bloodstream and get distributed throughout your body. The larger particles like PM 2.5, you might have heard about because they're regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency under the Clean Air Act. So is PM 10. These typically come from PM 2.5 can come from combustion products. PM 10 can derive from abrasion, windblown dust, forest fires, volcanoes, a variety of places. So if you look at the picture on the left, that's integrating some of these anthropogenic man-made sources and natural sources. So the anthropogenic sources of particles include the ones I just mentioned, transportation, but also the figure shows smokestacks from industry and power generation. So uh, um, there are additional sources of air pollution in urban areas simply because we have so many different possible sources, including traffic-related air pollution. In the Boston area, trap is dominant simply because we don't have a lot of other sources of pollution like industry or um, utilities. Natural sources are important in many places. So forest fires are a big source of pollution in many places. We've even had it here in the Boston area in the last couple of years. Volcanoes, there's about 1,500 active volcanoes in the world, and they play a role kind of locally and globally. So let me pass this on to actually before I do that, I need to connect this to health. So once traffic-related air pollution, particularly particles, can get into your bloodstream, they're associated with a whole bunch of different health effects, including cardiovascular and respiratory health effects. So it's amazing to read the health literature to see how many different organs and systems in the body are impacted by air pollution. So that's I think our main motivation for this project was to better understand um, air pollution in these four communities and try to tie it to health impacts as well as to what can be done to alleviate some of the pollution sources that we're seeing in these communities. So let me turn it over to Nilakshi, who will summarize our findings.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on a weekend morning. My name is Lakshi Huda, and I've sort of broken down the syllables in my Zoom name. I am a faculty at Tufts University in Civil and Environmental Engineering Department, where Professor Durant is also a faculty member. And I specialize, or at least I aim to specialize in understanding urban air pollution and the variation in urban air pollution, especially focusing on the pollution that originates from transportation sources, be it airplanes, be it small cars, and how that impacts or varies within our cities. I'm here to present some of the key findings of the study and have been engaged with this project mostly on the monitoring side, making measurements, designing little projects within this bigger project to understand certain problems that were presented to us by the community for which they needed greater information. And through 3 years of experience of doing that, what did we find? We found that the communities that we did study, 4 of them, experience high levels of air pollution, and they do so from many sources. At some point later in the slides, I will define what high level is within the study measurements. Yet we also found evidence that reduction of local traffic emissions can have a measurable improvement on local air qualities. These communities are impacted by a variety of sources, and yet reducing the local traffic emissions, very local, on the streets in the communities can have a measurable improvement on the air quality. And with all the work that we've put in, I think we're developing a fuller, complex picture of the variation in air quality in the communities. And it turns out it is a very complex picture. And maybe some more work is going to shed light on the variety of sources that are impacting these communities and how that impact varies even within a small community. Next slide, please. The approach that we took in this project was twofold. And you might hear the terms long-term monitoring or short-term projects in this presentation or also in the report associated with this study. When we say long-term monitoring, what we meant in this project was to set up a site at a location that sort of represented the community. And I know I said that there's a lot of variation in the community, and yet we were trying to find a central site that is more or less representative of the bigger, broader trends in the community and make measurements there for several years. And that is what we defined long-term in this project. This project was a 3-year project, so the longest that we could actually go was 3 years. And that is what we mean by long-term monitoring. The idea there was that let's capture the trend across multiple seasons so that we understand how do the concentrations vary across season, year to year, and see what trends recur and are common across communities, or at least common with respect to time and keep on repeating themselves. Then we also indulged in or took on some of the projects that were local community directed to capture the short-term trends in variation, be it spatial variation in air quality, be it temporal or change with respect to time in a community in response to some very specific community concerns. And I'll present examples of what those projects look like in each community. A typical monitoring setup looks like what we show here in red on the right-hand side in the pictures. We were trying to keep a low footprint because we did monitor at people's homes and in their backyards, and sometimes often on roofs of buildings for which we only had access through hatches and trying to go up. But it was, but most of it looked like a box that was thermally sort of controlled, and inside it resided several of our monitors, primarily a condensation particle counter, which you see here on the right-hand side. I don't know if my cursor can do it, but if you see a little gray box sitting inside a purple foam, that's what a condensation particle counter is. And that's what is used to measure ultrafine particles, which were a focus of this study. Before I move to showing you data, I do want to make a point about ultrafine particles. As John explained, traffic-related air pollution, or TRAP, is a complex mixture, right? Gases, all different types of particles. But we chose to study a marker of that complex mixture, ultrafine particles. And the reason why is that not only are ultrafine particles important by themselves and have been associated with health effects, they're an excellent proxy for tracking the impacts of trap. Uh, we don't want to measure every last thing that's called trap. That would be a very exhaustive and expensive project. So we chose to focus on ultrafine particles. That's a very good proxy for where that enriched air, the air that's enriched with trap, is impacting, to what extent that impact is happening. And instead of measuring everything, we chose to measure the one pollutant, ultrafine particles, that represents that variation really well. Next slide, please. Our long-term sites were located in Charlestown, which is shown on the left-hand side, bottom here. Greer, if you could, is it possible for you to sort of put the pointer on the sites as I'm talking? Thank you. So Charlestown, right there. Then Everett, and then further up in Malden. All these three sites were monitoring at all these three sites was conducted on top of a building. So Bunker Hill Museum in Charlestown, in Everett, we were able to make measurements right on top of the town hall. And in Malden, again, it was a multi-story building on top of that. Again, the idea was to not have our sites be overly impacted by one source, so that one intersection that's really close to the building that we are making measurements at, but maybe capture the big broad trend across the community at a little distance from the road that's down there, so that we are not overly impacted by one source and misinterpret the bigger, broader trend. What is shown here is a bunch of red and yellow dots. I assume that's what's visible on your screens. But this red and yellow dot is not just random dots. They're plotted in a format, what's called a pollutant rows. And a zoom in of that is shown on the right-hand side of the slide. And I want to spend a few minutes trying to walk you through on how to interpret these roses, because they're shown in a lot more greater detail in our report and also on the slides that are coming. Why do we before I sort of show you explain what rose means, let me talk to you about why we want to plot a rose. Well, emissions are coming out of the sources, but it is the forces of nature that are then determining, depending on the degree of dilution and dispersion, as to what the concentration is in the ambient air and where is what concentration. So, and that's why you might hear the word emissions differentiated from concentration. So emissions are something that come out of a source. Dispersion and dilution that happen after that emission has been emitted determines the eventual concentration that's going to occur. Now, what is that concentration going to be depends on which way the wind is blowing, what is the meteorology, and that's what we try to look at in wind roses. So we take a big long data set, years of data, and we plot a pollutant rose in the format shown on the right-hand side, wherein we take a data point, see which way the wind was blowing, what was the wind direction incident to that data point, what was the wind speed that was incident to that data point, and then plot it against that wind speed and wind direction. So the wind direction is on the 360-degree circle here, and then wind speed is the farther out that you go on the circle, the higher the wind speed, the closer you are to the center of the circle, the lower the wind speed. So the points in the center of this are points that have lower wind speed, further out have higher wind speed. And there's something about that is expected and should sort of conform to that expectation with traffic-related air emissions when we are looking at a windrows. Higher the wind speed, higher the dispersion, higher the dilution, the lower the concentration. So generally the trend is that you'd see redder dots or darker color dots that represent higher concentrations towards the middle of the circle. And as you go further and further out, high wind speeds, more dilution, more dispersion, lower concentration. If we see a trend in reverse, which we do see here, right? We look at higher wind speeds, And we don't really see lower concentrations, particularly in this wind sector, southeast winds. That tells us something about the nature of the emissions, that they might be coming from a buoyant flume, the emissions have rise up, or they might be getting released at a really high height, and then the dispersion dynamics can affect themselves in such a way that we might see higher concentrations even at higher wind speeds. So this is a really good way for us to take a lot of data, put it in one diagram, and then figure out what's going on, starting from the very first thing as like which direction should we be looking at, what direction is causing the highest concentrations, what direction is associated with a generally low concentration at these sites. And then quite literally, you can stand on top of the site where you're making measurements. And if this windrows plots us in the direction of southeast, as the southeast winds are associated with higher concentrations, we look towards the southeast of the site and try to figure out what might be the source that's located southeast of the site that is impacting this community. And I'll go over all of these in detail in the following slides. Next slide, please. So let's look at Charlestown in a little bit of detail. Charlestown is an interesting community. It's crisscrossed by so many transportation sources. I-93 on one side, Tobin Bridge on the other. Logan is not too far. There's also ferries that are moving around in the channel. And very little was known. I'm being generous when I say very little because I don't know of a single study in Charlestown before our study went to Charlestown and started making these measurements. And we observed a very curious pattern of really high concentrations during east and southeast winds. It wasn't unexpected. We have a lot of sources that are east and southeast located there. Logan Airport, even the ferry traffic in the channel. Next slide, please. Here's a windrows of Everett. What did we find in Everett was that the highest concentrations were observed during east, particularly southeast, and also south winds. And in parallel to these measurements, there were other studies conducted in collaboration with Myra in Everett that showed us the exact same or similar pattern getting repeated at multiple sites within the city, which really boosted our confidence in our long-term data set. And these high concentrations point towards Logan Airport and aviation activity. Now, John and I have been working on Logan's emissions for several years now. It was not an unexpected finding to us, but it really does reinforce the fact that when you have a big transportation infrastructure or a source like that, its impacts can spread to communities that are long downwind distances away from it. And certainly the extent of this impact at Everett, and which is also showing up in Malden, and I'll show in the next slide, was not recognized, and the degree to which it's impacting the concentrations in these communities was not recognized. So that's another key findings that came out of our study. And we did observe that lower concentrations are generally observed during north and northwest winds. And that is actually a really important point because north and northwest winds are pretty common in the areas where we live. So are south and southwest winds during summers, and north and northwest is the prevalent direction during winters. Southeast winds that are particularly associated with really high concentrations in Everett are actually not as frequent. So yes, those winds are associated with dramatically high concentrations, but the good news is that they don't occur as frequently. Next slide, please. And here's a very interesting windrows from Malden. And I mentioned in the previous slide that we do see high concentrations in south or southeast winds, which we did see in Malden. Great if you could point to the south and southeast sector here, further down. But what really sort of is very clear and obvious in this windrows is that there was clearly something that was to the southwest of the site where we were making measurements that was impacting the concentrations at this site. We did do our due diligence when we were trying to set up these sites because our goal was to not have it be overly impacted by one source. We wanted to capture big, broad trends. There was nothing to indicate to us at the point that we were trying to set up the site that there might be an industrial source that might be overly impacting that site. That was information that we actually discovered through making measurements with this study. That to me is important because it tells us that there is a lot yet to be known about what are the sources that are in these communities that are not even recognized for the impacts that they might be having on air quality within the community. And certainly the magnitude of it was a bit of a surprise to us as well. And we can discuss this in more detail as to what that source might be at a later point in the presentation if you have questions. Next slide, please. So let's put all this data together from the measurements and I'm trying to answer a big picture question here. All right, so how often are the high or not high levels experienced by these communities? So ultrafine particles are not regulated by themselves in United States, but World Health Organization does have some guidelines for what can be considered as high or low level. Now, low level is really low, few thousand particles per cc. None of our communities experience low levels. We live in an urban area. That's an unrealistic number for an urban area. You can go and there are rural areas in which those numbers can be found. So here I've tried to give you a sense of how often are the high levels experienced, and then what's not high is just not high. It doesn't go into low category pretty much. And we see that Charlestown experiences high levels more frequently than Everett or Malden. Everett and Malden sort of are pretty comparable in terms of how often they experience the high levels, so the trends might be a little bit different. For example, in Everett, we see high levels more frequently during morning hour, rush hour, than in Malden. But in Malden, we see high levels more frequently during evening hours than we do in Everett. So the blue lines are higher on the right-hand side, 6, 7 p.m., than green lines. The green lines are a little higher than the blue lines on the morning rush hour. Subtle differences. The big picture trend to take away from this is that during the morning rush hour and during the evening rush hour in the late evening is when the communities experience the highest frequency of high concentrations. And the high concentrations are defined as greater than 20,000 particles per cc for an hour-long measurement. Next slide, please. Let's zoom in a little bit further out of the hourly resolution and let's look at the trend overall with respect to seasonality, because I did say that meteorology or weather can play a significant role in how much dispersion and dilution is happening, and then that affects the concentrations, and concentrations are what are sort of regarded as, it's the threshold for high or low is stated in terms of concentrations. So the concentration, what's considered high for a whole day, for a 24-hour period, if you have greater than 10,000 particles on average, that's considered a high day or a high level day. Again, Charlestown experiences those more often. It's interesting that Charlestown experiences those more often in summers, which is a curious pattern compared to the two communities which experience higher concentrations during winters or colder months, which is what we expect from meteorology. That's not when the dispersion or dilution is the greatest, and winters are usually associated with higher concentrations. Summers, lower concentrations in both, lower frequency of high concentrations, and as well as the concentrations themselves are lower in Malden and Everett. Charlestown seriously is a very serious and interesting exception to that trend, which maybe we'll be studying further. It's definitely curious as to what's causing those concentrations to be even higher in the summer. Maybe the ferry traffic that goes up higher in the summers has a contribution. Maybe it's just the fact that it's driven by Logan, but Logan is a buoyant source, and the forces of dispersion and dilution, the way they act in the summer, are what's causing those concentrations to be higher. But it's a TBD, and hopefully we'll be able to continue our work in Charlestown. Next slide, please. But since the findings were curious, we did put in some effort, recreated those findings at several studies, in addition to being responsive to the Charlestown cab and municipal officials who wanted to have a better understanding of air quality impact of Tobin Bridge and I-93 and how the transportation infrastructure is impacting air quality in Charlestown. So we came up with this design that sort of the Bunker Hill Monument Museum long-term site is shown in the middle of the two crisscrossing lines that are shown and dashed. And we did set up sites along the east-west short-term monitoring transact, which is more like northwest, southeast, no, southwest, northeast, and then another transact that's southwest, northwest, and southeast. We made these measurements in fall of last year, and we compared them to the findings that the observations that we had at the long-term monitoring locations. Next slide, please. And we sort of saw a similar-ish trend. The short-term sites reinforced the trend that was observed in long-term data set that the highest concentrations were associated with east-southeast winds. But is it necessarily the Tobin Bridge that's causing them? That's not clear. In fact, there's evidence to suggest it might not be the Tobin Bridge that's the biggest driver of those concentrations. And we'd be looking at these further as we are continuing data collection in Charlestown. Next slide, please. The short-term project that we undertook in East Boston was in response to the Sumner Tunnel closure. The very first Sumner Tunnel closure created huge amounts of traffic in East Boston, and we were able to mobilize and go out in time to make measurements during the Sumner Tunnel closure, when it happened the second time around. Now the traffic situation was still pretty bad, but I think it was a little different in the second closure than the first closure. Nonetheless, it was a unique opportunity for us to make multiple weekend tunnel closure, to make measurements during a multiple weekend tunnel closure. This was a project that was in response to the community's concerns about the immediate impacts of traffic when these projects happen, but also the general impact of all the Logan-directed traffic that goes through East Boston. Next slide, please. Here's a timeline of our study. We worked in summer and then fall of the year that the tunnel closure happened, which I believe was 2023. Can someone correct me if I'm wrong here? Or was it 2023?
That's right. 2023.
2023. Interestingly, given the sites that we chose, we didn't see a significant difference in pollution concentrations when the Sumner Tunnel was open versus closed, which is not to say that it wasn't there. It may be that the sites that we did choose at the site were just so overly impacted by the sources that were right immediately next to them that little bit of change in traffic did not show up as a signal that we could parse out from this data set, which also sort of underscores the limitation of doing short-term studies of few months. Sometimes we just need longer data sets or the events themselves to be longer or really clear in their contrast on air quality for us to be able to tease them out at a short-term level, which we were able to do it in another study in Malden and Everett that is coming up next. Next slide, please. So This study that I just referred to is in Everett and Malden was in response to a question that was posed to us through surveys, through listening sessions, and CAB members on what the impact is of traffic to air quality at schools in Malden and Everett. In response to that, we decided that maybe the school shutdown week or the school vacation week in February, winter break, and then in spring break is a good opportunity for us to go make measurements during what we anecdotally know to be much lower traffic near schools because the school has a vacation week. And maybe make that measurements during that contrast that's being offered to us. Normal traffic before the school vacation week, lower traffic during the vacation week, and then again higher traffic during the week after once the school opens up. And next slide, please. And we made measurements at two schools, Lafayette School and Webster School in Everett. We tried to even choose a 2x2. We had its 2x2 decision matrix. Like, let's just not only look on the temporal contrast because of the school vacation week, but maybe also within that we can make measurements at two schools, a school that we know is generally located in a more trafficked area and a school that's generally located in a lesser trafficked area. Next slide, please. So those were chosen to be Lafayette and Webster schools where we made measurements in the February vacation week. Clearly, the data showed that during the weeks that the school was open, during the morning rush hours, we saw higher concentrations than the week during which the schools were closed. But you'll also see this curious pattern that when the schools are closed, we see higher concentrations in the evening, which is after 6 p.m. Again, which is not driven by the local traffic, but it's more driven by the meteorology of that week. We had a really cold spell during the vacation week, and meteorology just does make a difference. So we can also account for that because we had simultaneous measurements going on at central site, and we can normalize for that degree of difference that's being driven by meteorology. We did that. It did not change the results which are as follows, that local traffic does have an impact on local air quality in schools. It is an impact that can be measured, that can be quantified, and it is significant. If traffic was lower or traffic went away to the extent that it did go away during the vacation week, we'll probably be looking at concentrations that are comparable to weekends because we did also look at the concentrations during vacation week and the overall average during the whole year during the weekend. And why wouldn't it be that? So it sort of met our expectations there, the data. Next slide, please. The same project, similar methodology was then executed in Malden. With the two schools that we studied were Ferryway and Forestdale. It was this April or the spring vacation week that we targeted in Malden with the same approach. Interesting results. So we chose Forestdale School and to make measurements because we thought that was the school that has associated with lower traffic, and we were going into the study, we were expecting lower concentrations at the school itself. Ferryway is in a more trafficked area. Next slide, please. We found that when the schools were open, concentrations were higher. When the schools were closed, concentrations were lower. But within the two schools, the data was flipped. We were expecting lower concentrations at Forestdale and higher at Ferryway, but we didn't quite see that because the structures around the school where we made measurements, again, do impact the degree to which the emissions are getting diluted and dispersed. And the way the Ferryway school is constructed is like you go through a road and you turn around and both of them are sort of have this taller buildings on either side, which may be the reason as to why we didn't see the degree of dilution we were expecting, even though Forestdale is generally located in a lower traffic area. That one particular point near the school where we made measurements may not be getting as much dispersion and dilution from that lower traffic, which may be leading to higher concentrations. But the general expectation that we had, or the hypothesis that we had going into the study when we were making measurements, is that during the school closure, we should see lower concentrations. During the normal school weeks, we should see higher concentrations, and that delta that we are able to uh, measure or quantify is the degree to which one can reasonably say the local traffic is impacting the concentrations at the school. All that did pan out, and the degree to which it impacts the concentrations is such that if that traffic went away, we would probably be something at par with the weekend concentrations. Next slide, please. I have gone over all these in great detail when we went over each slide, so I'm just going to go to the next slide, please. This is a summary slide of the concentrations. So let me take a minute to summarize our big, broad key findings through the study. Communities experience high levels of traffic-related air pollution or ultrafine particles. Ultrafine particles are an excellent proxy of TRAP, which is what we measured and quantified. We saw that expected and recognized sources of traffic, such as sources such as vicinal traffic, local traffic on streets, does impact air qualities. There are sources, big, large sources such as Logan Airport that are recognized sources of traffic-related air pollution, but we weren't quite expecting the degree to which they impact air quality in distant communities like Everett and Malden, and we were able to quantify that and demonstrate that clearly, that these communities do see a detrimental impact on air quality when the wind is from the direction of the Logan Airport. And then there were some unexpected and newly discovered impacts from locally situated industrial sources, specifically in Malden. But I should also mention that communities also experience not high levels, and these are driven mostly by meteorological conditions, such as winds from the northwest or northeast directions that are associated with lower concentrations. Also, the midday period is generally associated with lower concentrations to the extent that those concentrations would not be considered high. There's also strong evidence that reduction in local emissions or tighter controls can have a measurable impact on local air quality. So this might be a good avenue for advocacy where we can clearly demonstrate that a little bit of reduction in local traffic will have a significantly demonstrable impact on air quality. But also there's evidence that we need to do more work, and we do not quite yet fully understand the complexity of air quality variation in the communities. Next slide, please. And with that, I will pass on to the next speaker.
Yeah, so thank you, Nilakshi. Before we begin to transition into questions and answer, and I'll put this in the chat in a moment, it was referenced during the presentation, but we do have a study report available on Mystic River Watershed Association's website. There is a web page that has all the clean air information that we went over today, as well as the study report that summarizes the key findings from the 4 communities. There will also be 2 pages of information for each of the community findings that will be available soon on the website. And also the report includes an action guide. So also if you're, thinking about for you or other people in your life, what are some things that could be done on the individual or community level to respond to air quality concerns, there is an action guide available for folks. And then also if you join the Myra newsletter, they send out various updates about different policy work that they're doing, but also other types of ways that people can be involved with Myra as they do other water and air quality work in the watershed. So we are going to transition into Q&A. If you have a question, you're welcome to come off mute and ask them. I'll have Nalakshi and John maybe come back on. That way, if we have questions, you two can answer it. Or if you have questions and want to put them in the chat, we can do it that way as well, and I can read it for you. Any questions?
All right, I'll ask a question. This is Victor Castro. And sorry, I can't be on camera in sort of loud environments, so sorry for the background noise. I guess my question is, what when there's like sort of macro sources of air pollution like Logan Airport, I'll say, I don't know if macro is the right word, but how does that mask more regional or local air pollution, right? So like if there's and can you also just talk about, I guess, the story about the coffee roasters in Malden? Like, how did you actually know that it was that over there based on the diagram?
John, do you want to take that? Coffee roaster?
The coffee roaster was relatively easy compared to the sources of pollution at ground level in Charlestown. The reason why the coffee roaster was easy is because we could see the plume rising from a single location over and over again, and that was in Malden. So when we were up on the rooftop site measuring ultrafine particles, we could actually see emissions coming out of the coffee roaster establishment, and we took pictures, followed it over several days, weeks, months, and we could see the quality of the emissions, and we actually videotaped it, and so it was quite clear what was coming out of the stack was emissions, and our DEP colleagues informed us that the emissions were such that it required further investigation as to why the emissions were so high. And so that led to conversations with DEP and with folks at the coffee roaster. So that was a relatively easy one. The first question you asked about background concentrations versus large source concentrations at the airport, that's a really good question. So we know that background concentrations of ultrafine particles and other pollutants are there all the time because Boston and other urban areas are impacted by local, regional, and even global background sources continuously. Logan is a big signal, especially when wind is blowing from the airport. And so that kind of just drowns out everything when Logan emissions are being blown towards your monitoring site. And so that's why the polar plots that Nilashi talked about are so important because that allows you to see the pollution concentration changes as a function of wind direction. So the 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 differences between the colored dots really gives you a sense for the contributions from these highly enriched local sources like the airport versus background. And so I think the ratio when you have really high concentrations coming from the airport to background is going to be like 10 to 1 or even higher. Hopefully that answers your question. But it's a great question,
Yeah, it
Victor.
does. I'm just trying to piece it all together. There's so many dimensions going on here that it's so hard to
Yeah,
track. Yeah.
Yeah, so
indeed.
Victor, I can answer your question in more methods ways, and I'll answer it generally, and you can take that finding and almost apply it to any setting. So, a really good way to sort of tease out what source is making a contribution at a site is we plot the windows, we see, okay, which direction do we need to look in for the highest concentrations. But this is just like that plot really was, and the conversation today was focused on the really red rich higher concentrations, but you could apply it to any data that's in that windows, right? Um, then we start looking at the data hour by hour, right? Even if we're looking at Logan, we know that there are certain hours in which Logan operations do go down low. There's no flight activity, or the particular runway is not getting used, right? And you start looking at data hour by hour, okay? What is happening at this source? Maybe if it's like a local industrial facility, if it doesn't operate 24/7, we can look for instances where the wind was blowing from the same direction, but the facility was not operating. wind is blowing from the same direction, but the facility was operating. And then again, that gives us a little bit more higher degree of confidence in our data that this might be something to do with the facility, because only when the facility is operating do we see the higher concentrations in this and that particular wind direction. So the Logan has been studied a lot, and we've sort of done all our due diligence on it, looking at examples of what the flight activity is doing at Logan. And I I interpreted your first question as like when you have a big macro source like Logan, and sort of what does it does to the background concentrations, or how can you even tease that out? I think John answered it to some extent, saying like it's a big whopping concentration, but and it's really clear in the data, that contrast in the data set. Um, but we can also look for contrast in activity within the source itself and try to establish what is the relative contribution of that source as it ramps up over time. A good example of what would be studies that were done on Logan during the COVID period when we knew that the flight activity had gone down by 70%. And how much did that change the concentration even when the wind was from the same direction and the wind was from the direction of Logan, and we knew there was some activity from Logan. So you can look for these situations in which you can establish a clear contrast of 1 or 0, facilities on or off, or there's a significant change in the activity of the facility or flight activity from Logan, and then increase your degree of confidence because every time that changes, the concentrations track with that change.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you.
Are there other questions? Okay. Well, if there's no additional questions, then we will end our meeting for today. The recording will be made available on Myra's website, as we mentioned earlier. And again, you can see the webpage for additional resources about the study. And we hope that you have a good rest of your Saturday. So thank you so much for coming, and have a great day.
Thank you very much. Really interesting.
Thank you.